For those of you that don't know me, I'm Robert Capper. I'm head of the commercial team at Housekeeping and I'm also head of Insights, which for us includes our Brexit agenda. I'm going to chair the webinar this morning and lead you through the proceedings. Format today, we've got three brief presentations. We've got a presentation from Nicholas Groffman, who is head of our international team, followed by a brief presentation from me about what we're seeing around Brexit, and then we've got a session then from Claire Day, who leads our real estate finance team, before we then go into the breakout groups. I'll talk about those in a minute, and then at the very end then we'll give you the feedback from those breakout rooms. Just a few housekeeping rules. We are broadcasting remotely this morning, so please bear with us if we have any technical glitches. Unfortunately, despite the best efforts of our IT department and our marketing teams, inevitably we do suffer technical issues from time to time, but please bear with us. Let's get started. Our first presentation is from Nicholas Groffman. As I say, Nicholas leads our international team, and he's going to talk to you about Brexit and the Brexit transition and how that is coming together in the dying weeks ahead of the 31st of December. So I'll pass you over to Nicholas. Nicholas, over to you.
Thank you, Robert. Morning, everyone. So I've been given the topic of Brexit update, which I interpret as meaning that I can talk about anything as long as it's loosely related to Brexit. So obviously, I'm going to focus on where we are with Brexit first and the negotiations with the EU. But I'm also going to look at our relationship with countries outside the EU, because that has already become closer. So we have closer ties with countries outside the EU as a direct result of Brexit. That's where new opportunities lie. So to be clear, Brexit has already happened, right? The UK left the EU on the 31st of January 2020. We are in a transition period under the withdrawal agreement, and that's an international treaty, and that transition period ends on the 31st of December. So you've got 39 days to go. During this period, the UK and the EU are negotiating a permanent trade agreement, and it's worth noting that the UK and the EU already have agreed on lots of other matters. We're just talking about the trade agreement. That trade agreement currently being negotiated would arguably amount to the UK having its cake and eating it. You know, that was the having our cake and eating it is the thing that nobody wants us to have, apart from the British. We would be free to negotiate trade deals with other countries, and we would also have the benefit of an agreement with Europe. Now, of course, it's quite possible that we don't get that deal. As my colleague Robin Colhoven likes to remind us, the Internal Market Bill suffered its second defeat in the Lords yesterday. That's the bill that preserves devolved governments' existing powers to have a say on the repatriating market rules. And then in the EU, several heads of state, including those of France, the Netherlands, and Spain, have warned Michel Barnier, don't accept a deal with the UK if it turns out to be worse for the bloc than no deal. That's the no deal is better than a bad deal, now being voiced by European Union leaders. Now, Barnier is expected to brief, he's supposed to be briefing the EU 27 either early tomorrow or late tonight. He's now our best friend in Europe. So if we don't get a deal, which would be a shame, but it wouldn't be the disaster that some have suggested. And I want to run through some of those, you know, we all like talking about those predictions that all turned out to be wrong. Some of them are relevant to what we're talking about now. So back in 2016, in the run-up to the referendum, I recall discussing with an economist from Deutsche Bank, the chief UK economist, the guy based in London, why all the scenarios that were predicted, why did they all place the UK in a worse financial position 10 years from 2016? And he explained that's because it's not possible to model for positive outcomes, because all the positive outcomes, although conceptually valid, were too uncertain to do financial modeling for. All you could do was model for the loss of trade with the EU, and then model for mitigating measures to be taken by government. Now, that's a very sort of Brexity comment to make. This economist was working in that way, not because he was an ardent Remainer. He was doing it because that's how they process data, quite forgivably so. This kind of thinking meant that all those predictions, as we know now, they all went wrong. The first being that following the referendum result, the stock market did drop. The Treasury, the Bank of England, the economists, the FT, and everybody predicted that it would continue to fall, that it wouldn't really recover, and there would be a new normal of a low level. But actually, since the Brexit vote, the FTSE 100 has climbed over 20% over that period on average. Then you got the exchange rate that dropped, the pound dropped, as we all know, and that encouraged investment into the UK because our stuff was so cheap. But it's now gone back to a higher position than it was. It's 5% stronger than it was in 2016, measured against the dollar. So other global currencies, it always matters what's happening there. Did they all go up? No, they didn't. So the Chinese renminbi, the Japanese yen, the euro, they're either flat or they've depreciated against the dollar over the same period. Again, back in 2017, the London School of Economics predicted that Brexit would cause a 9% hit to the British GDP over the following 4 years. And actually what we've done is grow an average of 1.6% up until COVID, obviously, annually. That's not high. That's not a high growth rate. We're normally around about 1.8% or whatever it is. But it's not a drop of 9%, which was what was predicted. And last point, what about all the job losses? So we were going to lose thousands of jobs as firms relocated to EU countries. When firms did relocate, there was a great deal of media coverage of that. Overall, however, the employment rate continued to go up. It was unemployment was at a 44-year low just before COVID. And the best example of this is a bank like Goldman Sachs. So Goldman Sachs were absolute geniuses in this. They continually expanded in the UK market after the referendum so fast that they were intentionally, this year they've been intentionally putting the brakes on, this is before COVID, just so they didn't want to run afoul of Britain's growth limits on financial institutions. At the same time, this is the genius bit, they were asking for tax concessions from the UK government to entice them to stay in the UK. They didn't actually get the tax concessions, but it was a really nice try. And then the auto world, we know that Nissan recently closed EU factories in Spain and Germany. They've been expanding in the UK. So we're going to come back to those points. My aim is not to show that the Brexiteers were all right. In fact, a lot of the Brexiteer arguments were grounded in far less evidence than the professional economists and politicians on the Remain side. So key Brexiteers were making claims based on no evidence compared to Remainers who were making claims based on some evidence. But much of those economists, much of their work was, in our view anyway, completely detached from and had no faith in the ingenuity of British business. So there was a sort of assumption that British business would carry on exactly its behavioral patterns for the previous 20 years. Now, if like us or like me, you're lucky enough to work with the owners of successful British SMEs and British entrepreneurs, you knew that from day one, you didn't know what the solution was, but you knew that they were not just going to plod along like lemmings, that they would of course revisit their business models to somehow reduce their exposure to Europe. We didn't know how they were going to do that. We had our suggestions and ideas, but we've observed. So, after that, this is a very more than a warm-up here. You can certainly say, well, Nicholas Groffman's just a lawyer. What does he know about it? These are our observations. This is what actually happened over the period. So what is actually happening with the transition? So we're probably stuck on the same slide. Let's stay on this slide for the time being. Sorry, Amelia. We're still on the transition to importing and exporting goods. From the 1st of January 2021, customs declarations will be required. And this is all based on the assumption that we don't get a proper deal that deals with this. Customs declarations are going to be required when importing or exporting from the EU, unless something magical happens. The rules for some goods will change. So import licenses or certificates, marketing, labeling standards, all the regulatory stuff that you will hear about from the real experts. You'll have to have a GB, a Great Britain AORI number for import or export goods from the EU. Customs duty, VAT, will need to be paid on pretty much all imports. There'll be zero rate VAT though. So, we say VAT is chargeable, but in some cases 0 rate on most exports to the EU. EU business receiving exports from the UK will need to make customs declarations. So it'll be that bit harder to import from us. And they might need a license or a certificate. And then you get issues around travel to the EU, and you'll need this, you can't have a 10-year-old passport. Your European health insurance card will cease to be valid from the 1st of January, probably, unless again we get some special deal. So you should get travel insurance to visit the EU. These are not disastrous restrictions on life. The same sort of stuff you would need if you were going to a country outside the EU. Data roaming, that's the other one. Check with your phone operator. Now, I don't want to get into too much detail, and a lot of this, the other matters relate to immigration, which is Michael's expertise, so I'm not going to mention that. And now we can have slide 2, please. So, latest on the UK's free trade agreements. Now, a lot of this stuff you can just look up, so I don't want to talk too much about the kind of detail that you can just get from gov.uk. But before I talk about these free trade agreements, I want to comment on the significance of these, because I think the guys in the civil service who've been negotiating these things have not received, I think, the credit they deserve. So yeah, I was in a meeting yesterday with the Director of European Affairs at the Confederation of Danish Industry, along with Harriet Murray-Jones from our firm. And we were talking about Danish trade with the UK after Brexit. Bear with me, I'm not just going to talk about Denmark here. This is an example. So I mentioned the FTAs that we're negotiating. And so this chap from the Confederation of Danish Industry, he said that Danish companies would feel it was worth investing in the UK and setting up companies here just to take advantage of the UK-Japan free trade agreement. And you'll have seen in the news that we've got a free trade agreement with Japan. Some people have said, oh, it's just a continuation of the EU one. Oh, it's not enough of our GDP to worry about. I think that's mad. I mean, the UK digital sector, which is covered by this free trade agreement, not covered by the EU-Japan free trade agreement, is incredibly important for our economy, and it becomes increasingly so. Now, for the Danes, their economy is in some ways similar to ours. Digital is a really important part of their economy. So for the rest of the EU, maybe, if you're in Greece or Spain, digital isn't yet such a big thing. So they didn't care when they negotiated the EU-Japan free trade agreement to cover digital. And also they made noises about GDPR, what happens if our data is shared with the Japanese, as if somehow Japan is a crazy wild west of a place that's going to steal all your data. So the message here is that if we keep going like this, we've already got lots of free trade agreements with South American countries, all of Central America, and various others that are under negotiation that look like coming to fruit. We really hope the US one comes to fruit. More on that in a bit. We will have more valuable free trade agreements with non-EU countries, and that will help UK business. If it's attractive enough for people to want to invest here just to take advantage of them, then that's pretty good. So a brief update on these. You know, the government really messes around with this. A lot of them, under the Constitutional Reform and Governance Act, there's supposed to be 21 sitting days before trade agreements can be ratified, and we keep missing these deadlines. That's part of the reason we haven't got more signed, but we already have a lot. The biggest one is the EU one, which we've just talked about. No deal is reached, then it's WTO terms, tariffs, increasing costs for business. The outstanding issues are all those ones about fishing waters, regulation on workers' rights, and so on. Oh, and the role of the ECJ, the European Court of Justice. And then that, as I mentioned before, the internal market bill that's just suffered a heavy defeat because it's being suggested that it would overrule, it would possibly break international law if that clause was triggered, which I guess is true. But those that have been agreed, Japan, Switzerland, South Korea, the Southern African Customs Union, the other trade blocs, Israel, the Andean countries, Chile. Chile, I think, is still under discussion. We have mutual recognition agreements with the USA, Australia, and New Zealand. That's not as good as a trade agreement, but it means we recognize each other's standards. The US election obviously will affect free trade agreement negotiations, but in my view, not in a negative way. I've written about this elsewhere, but I think that there have been some very positive noises from the incoming, we hope, incoming administration in the United States. Biden and Johnson have already talked about this. As long as we don't screw up on the Good Friday Agreement, that is a distinct possibility. And there's a lot of leeway on how we interpret whether or not we've screwed up on the Good Friday Agreement. Canada, UK's 5th bilateral trade partner. Now, there isn't time to list all the, where we are with all these free trade agreements. But the point here is that, again, we take a trajectory here. Our trade with the European Union as a proportion of total trade has been diminishing steadily since around about 2003. Now, if you carry on the trajectory, you end up with EU trade being about 25% as opposed to around about 49 or 50% currently, 25% by the year around about 2047. And that's based on a trajectory calculated by Hannah Clements, my trainee. And I'm absolutely sure that that is right. So similar, that's true for inward and outward trade. Now, it's worth noting that that trajectory is based on the pre-Brexit, or rather including the Brexit period and the pre-Brexit period. So obviously, the massive catalyst to all that will be the fact that we are now going to have free trade agreements with other countries. And so it may be before 2047 that we hit that. So the message to British companies that are not already doing this, and most are, is to investigate those overseas markets even more carefully than you were before. Because previously, as I said, many companies have recalibrated to look at those overseas markets, the non-EU markets, while trying to retain their EU market position. Those that have done that have tended to profit because those markets are developing more quickly, generally speaking. And we're talking about difficult markets here, China, India, and so on. It's amazing how little trade there is with China, how little trade there is with Japan. So with Japan, I think it's 14 billion total trade back and forth, compared to Belgium, much, much smaller country, 28 billion. China, 46 billion worth of trade. That sounds like a lot, but it's nothing, but it's smaller than the trade we have with the Netherlands. So clearly there is a huge potential with these massive markets that don't have the kind of products that we have. You can also look at investment figures as well for a sense of where we are in terms of relationship. China has about a stock of about $3 billion of investment in the UK, which is unbelievably small. You compare that with the US with 500 billion. So 3 billion versus 500 billion. We're worrying about China taking all our assets, but so far, nothing much has happened. It's just the beginning. So as I said, we need a far greater focus on trading in the apparently more difficult markets. It does seem that we're moving in the right direction. We're unlikely to have our cake and eat all of it, but we might just manage to, I'm trying to think of another, to eat a few slices, to have our cake and eat a few slices of it. So that is all from me. Sorry, I didn't go through all the slides, but I don't stick to slides anyway. So thank you very much.
So thank you, Nicholas. That was a really useful overview of where we are with Brexit and how we're working towards the transition. And I'll pick up on a number of themes that you've identified in that transition when I can give you now my overview of what we're seeing with clients. So it's perhaps useful, first of all, just to give you a bit of context. I have a wide view of where clients are at, both in my role as National Head of Commercial across the firm, and also in my role as Head of Insights, dealing with the Brexit agenda for us as a firm, and then also more recently COVID-19 and before that GDPR. Because actually COVID and GDPR are having an impact on Brexit almost certainly. Certainly what we're not seeing anyway, and I'll talk about that in a moment. And within my role as Head of Commercial and Head of Insights, I deal with and see a range of clients across different sectors, different geography, and of course different sizes. And as a commercial lawyer, I deal with their day-to-day issues and their day-to-day challenges. And inevitably, in dealing with those day-to-day matters, end up in quite wide-ranging conversations about everything and anything in and around, and even outside of their business and the commercial issues they face. So I've probably got the best place of a lot of people to actually give you some observations about Brexit and how we're seeing Brexit through our clients' eyes. And actually put a wide range of clients' eyes as well. So what is happening? What are we seeing? And I think probably first of all, it'd be quite useful to say what we're not seeing, and perhaps it's not seeing in relation to what we saw last time. Remember, this is our second time trying to get across the Brexit deadline. What we're not seeing this time is we're not seeing lots of discussion, we're not seeing lots of debate. And okay, last time around, perhaps a lot of that discussion, perhaps a lot of that debate was really around politics. But nevertheless, there was a lot of chatter around business and the effect on business and how business is going to operate. We're not seeing that this time around. We've definitely not seen the politics around it, but we're not even seeing really the business chatter that we're seeing. Something else we're not seeing panic. No panic at all. Clients are not panicking. Last time around, of course, lots and lots of panic. This time, no panic. We're not seeing that. Something else we're not seeing the big measures that we saw last time. Last time around, lots of our manufacturing clients were stockpiling. They were stockpiling raw materials, they were stockpiling finished products. Our retailing clients were stockpiling stock, and that was going on big numbers well in advance of the deadline last time. We're not seeing that as much this time around. Now, that may be because they've still got stocks from last time. On balance, I don't think so. It may be that COVID has had an impact on that, and the people either don't feel they need the same level of stock, or alternatively, they haven't got the cash to actually have the stock. And I'll be very interested to hear what Robin has to say about that in one of the breakout rooms later. And the other thing we're not seeing is clients aren't seeing it as a threat or a challenge this time round. Instead, quite the opposite, and I'll touch upon this later, is clients see it as an opportunity. And that probably is the biggest difference this time round to last time, is clients definitely see it as an opportunity and are looking at new markets. And Nicholas talked just now about Japan and how the Japan Free Trade Agreement opens up Japan, and then how the Danish businesses are really looking to come and invest in the UK. There's opportunity, and I think this time around there's no panic, and instead it's looking at what's the opportunity here and how can clients move forward and grab those opportunities. So I suppose the natural question to flow on from that is, well, why is that? What's different this time around? And I think possibly there's a number of factors there at play from what we're seeing and what we're hearing from clients. I think the first, probably the biggest, is we've been here before, we're kind of comfortable, probably parallels really with lockdown. Lockdown one, first lockdown, everybody was finding out what it was all about, getting to understand it, getting to apply it, getting to work around it. Lockdown two has been easier. It hasn't been easy, but it's been easier. And I think this second run at Brexit deadline, I feel they've been there and they've done it. I think they also feel it's inevitable, and I think it's going to happen. And so clients are definitely moving on within that space. So moving on from that, then what are we seeing? Well, I think what we are seeing is a more measured approach, and it's a more measured approach to planning for the Brexit transition, and that's planning both for this period leading up to the transition itself as we hit the deadline, and then the new world beyond the deadline. And we're seeing a lot more planning. And on the back of that, then we're seeing a lot more action this time around, but all in a very measured, controlled way, a proportionate way, a balanced way. But a lot of that planning, though, a lot of those actions are around opportunities and how do we strike into new markets? How do we move away from the EU, accepting that inevitability? I mean, Nicholas gave a very stark figure, 50+% of trade at the moment, 25% of trade in 20 years' time. Clients are already onto that. Clients are probably going to accentuate that shift. Certainly in our experience, that's what we're seeing. Lots of manufacturing clients looking all around the world. I came off a phone call this morning with a manufacturing client looking to appoint distributors around the Middle East. Why? Because they want to diversify away from Europe. And that's a very typical conversation of what I'm seeing and hearing at the moment. There's a range, though, of issues that people are looking at within their planning and within their actions. Apart from looking to identify new markets, which a lot of clients are doing, there's a real focus upon GDPR and data protection. Now, whether that's because GDPR is up the agenda, because it's been pushed hard by the government and the ICO and lawyers and professional advisors, but certainly a lot of the Brexit planning and the actions are in and around GDPR. So if you've got data, you're moving data in and out of the EU, then that's something you should almost certainly be looking at. Similarly, trademarks are important at the moment. Lots of people who've got EU trademarks are looking very closely at their portfolio and looking at how that portfolio is managed. Inevitably, though, import-export, our manufacturing clients in particular, really focused on how they're importing and exporting. Conversation last week with a client who imports chemicals, real concerns to make sure, A, they've got the best stocks available at the moment, but not excessive amounts of stock, but also they've got the stock in the right place, and also that they've got the best possible position ready for when any deal is announced. And of course, you won't be surprised, immigration advice, making sure people have got the right team in place at the right time, and that people are actually planned for and everything's following through. And then finally, then I suppose the other area that we're seeing a lot of advice at the moment is around trade and trade finance. Trade finance is becoming increasingly important now, particularly international trade finance. And lots of clients, again, are planning and working through the actions that they need to do to actually make sure that they've got their trade finance arrangements in place. So I've got a call later next week with a client who's looking to make sure they've not only got their commercial contracts in place with their new customers, but actually they've got all the trade finance that sits behind it. And inevitably, we work very closely, not just with Nicholas and his international team on delivering commercial work now, but we work with Javid in our international trade finance team, so that the client can have a wall-to-wall end-to-end delivery on that advice, because that's what they are looking for, particularly as they focus on new markets and new opportunities. And that is the big difference this time around. There's not the panic, as I keep saying, and there's very much a how do we take this forward, what we make, and how do we make the most out of it. I think the fact that you're all on this webinar this morning shows that you yourselves are planning and are taking action, and it's very typical of the events we've been running, that we're getting good attendance, and again from a range of clients, a range of sectors, a range of geography, a range of size, and you're all engaging in that review process. And that's something we're helping clients with across the spectrum, whether it be joining in their discussions, joining in their reviews, whether it be carrying out audits for them, whether it be dealing with actually some of the actions that come out of it. We're there to help, whether it's providing ad hoc advice, whether it's longer term project advice. And the team's here to help you make it happen. And that's very much the focus at the moment with our clients that we're seeing is clients want to make it happen. They think Brexit's inevitable now. Of course it is, it's in statute. We've got the deadline. They think a deal's going to come. They're not quite sure what shape the deal's going to come, but they're putting in place the steps that they need to feel they need to have in readiness for the inevitable transition. I guess the last comment for me would be, how can we help? We're here to help. We're here to say make it work. Talk to us. Talk to any of the speakers today. All our details are available on our website. Talk to anybody else in the Harris & Black Rickaby's team that you see on the website. Look at our Brexit Hub. You'll find that on our Insights page. For those of you that have been there, there's a huge amount of detail there to help you look at some of the key issues, as I say, around trademarks, GDPR, import-export, trade finance, immigration, and of course attend our events. And if there are other events that you want us to hold, or there are issues you want us to address, to update, please let us know. But certainly the message from me is very different this time around. We're seeing a real shift in focus with clients this time, and certainly it'll be interesting to see how people taking that forward over the weeks and months ahead plays out. But certainly Nicholas's prediction of a shift in dynamic around EU and our trade around the rest of the world is certainly something that we can easily foresee happening. But hopefully that gives you enough of what we're seeing, and hopefully help set the scene for some of the discussions we're going to have in the Q&A sessions in the chat rooms. So that's all from me on that at this stage. I'm now going to pass over to Claire Day, who leads our real estate finance team. They ran a very interesting project around the impact of COVID, and she's going to talk about some of the lessons that her team have learned and the clients have learned during that, and how we can pass those lessons through and apply them in Brexit. So Claire, over to you.
Thank you, Robert. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Claire Day. I head up the real estate finance team here at HCR. I also sit within the wider finance sector group that we have here. And what we did over the summer was we hosted 2 sessions where we invited business leaders and key decision makers to come and join us to sit around a table, virtually obviously, and discuss how COVID and the effects of the pandemic have resulted in them having to make changes to their business, and how they've adapted to those changes and the effects that COVID has had. So it occurred to us that some of these lessons, which you can hopefully see on your screen now, are, whilst they came out of a COVID situation, may be applicable to the Brexit transition that we're now faced with. Now, obviously, there's a difference between COVID and Brexit, predominantly due to the fact that COVID was pretty much launched at us with no warning, and everybody had to very quickly adapt and make changes. And we've obviously had a lot more time to prepare for Brexit. But we felt that some of the themes coming out of the lessons that we learned were probably relevant for the Brexit situation. So I'm just going to pick out some of the key themes. I'm not going to go through each of the lessons captured, but I think from what we saw and from speaking to the groups, by far the most important issue was leadership and communication. Now, with change comes unrest, whether that's amongst your staff, your suppliers, your customers and clients. And so it's really vital that and key that you let people know how the business is adapting to change. It was felt that those that are leading the business and making those key decisions needed to get above the business. So rather than getting involved in the day-to-day running of it, they needed to take a step back to be able to make those really important key decisions, rather than making knee-jerk reactions, which could obviously prove costly in the long run. Now, just as we saw with COVID, business leaders, as we canter towards the end of the year, are going to be faced with some pretty overwhelming decisions. What are the regulatory consequences of Brexit? What is the business contractual exposure? How robust are the contracts that are already in place? Where can businesses now trade and how freely? And in short, how is Brexit going to impact on the business? So they're all questions that decision makers need to be thinking about as we approach the transition period at the end of the year. And whilst businesses may well have had some really good, well thought through plans prior to COVID, I think the problem we're now faced with is that COVID has pretty much turned everything on its head, and some of those plans may now need to be revisited. So business leaders need to look at the interplay between COVID and Brexit and think about whether there's a business plan that takes account of COVID and the impacts that COVID has had. As I said, we've had more time to come to terms with Brexit, but equally, the situation is that businesses are now faced with a situation that's essentially out of their control, and they need to be able to react. It was also apparent from discussions that it didn't really matter about the size of a company, but as long as the mindset was right and the people making those decisions were equipped with the ability to take stock of the situation and have the time to make those decisions, it didn't really matter how big or small a business was. Another key lesson that we learned was the importance of relationships. Now, we talked in our groups about long-term relationships with clients and customers and how important it was to empathize with clients and customers so that we could truly understand what their needs were and be able to offer solutions. However, with the effect of transitioning out of the EU, it's more important as ever, and as Robert alluded to in his presentation earlier, it's really important that businesses are close to their professional advisors. They're going to need the help and assistance in navigating through the changes of the transformation from EU law into domestic UK law and what that means for their businesses. We're already seeing a lot of experts coming out into the marketplace offering advice on getting your business Brexit ready, as we saw with the recent GDPR changes. And so it's essential that business leaders have access to that information and that sector-specific advice to be able to navigate through those changes. So taking Brexit specifically, it could be that suppliers are worried about the financial instability going forward. They may want to enter into longer term contracts, and that might in turn lead to a drop in prices. Or businesses may be looking to safeguard and future-proof their businesses, which in turn will result in more dialogue with funders and banks, looking at lending facilities that might be prudent for businesses going forward. So it was felt that those businesses that really took the time to invest in those relationships were the ones that were going to come out the other end stronger. We also asked the group to consider risk, and we asked them whether their perception of risk had changed as a result of COVID. Overwhelmingly, as you would expect, the group felt that most definitely the perception of risk had changed in terms of business requirements, future-proofing. But amongst the chaos, and as Nicholas also alluded to earlier, there were definitely going to be opportunities. So new ways of working, looking at new products, new systems. Just taking HCR, for example, we had an employment team who was suddenly advising on furlough. Now that's a word that nobody had heard of prior to COVID. We had our banking team having to quickly get to grips with CBILS loans and banks back loans. We had our commercial team launch a brand new product, HCR Flex, recognizing that clients wanted transparency on costs and offering a solution where there was essentially a pick and choose menu and full transparency on costs, allowing clients access to commercial legal advice as and when they needed it. So I think risk is something that comes with the territory of running a business. And the same questions are going to be asked for Brexit as they were with COVID. Are we heading for another recession? Will there be more corporate insolvencies? Do I need or will I need to make redundancies going forward? And I think as a group, it was felt that sometimes we can hold back, and sometimes being so risk adverse means that you don't necessarily make the key decisions that might actually enable you to progress in the business. But again, COVID has shown us that as long as you can adapt and evolve and be able to react to change, then you are still able to reap the rewards and take those opportunities when they arise. And finally, we looked at flexible working. Now, this is something that has been completely turned on its head as a result of COVID. And one thing COVID has done is it's forced businesses to embrace flexible working. Just looking at HCR by way of an example, we mobilized an entire workforce of over 600 people in 3 days. Now that's a project that would in itself normally take months to achieve. So I think it couldn't have come at a better time as far as Brexit is concerned. Prior to COVID, a majority of the UK workforce were probably facing some form of barrier to flexible working, whether that's the hours that they were working, the location they were working from, or even just not having the IT systems in place. But also moving around as well. We've now found that there's less of a need to meet in person. I was never in the same location twice in a week, and now a day in the office is like a day out for me. We've had physical meetings taken over by the likes of Zoom calls and Microsoft Teams, and so there's less of a need to travel around now. So again, it creates more opportunities for businesses, and it just means that we're just having to adapt our ways of working. Flexibility is going to be key to retaining top talent and a major factor of the UK's Brexit survival going forward. It's also going to create opportunities. So there may well be, once the furlough scheme ends next year, there may well be an increase in unemployment. But that doesn't necessarily mean we can't capitalise from those opportunities and look to redeploy domestic workers, for example. So just drawing to a conclusion in terms of where we left it, I think as a group we concluded that COVID has taught us that the way we respond to a situation when we're not in control can actually trigger better ways of working. And I think going forward, we're definitely going to be learning new lessons from Brexit, in addition to those lessons that we've learned from COVID. But there will be new opportunities, there will be new ways of working, less regulatory red tape, perhaps, as a result of us transitioning out of the EU, and changes to the dynamics of the UK workforce. So again, it goes back to what Robert was talking about. Preparation is key. And I think those businesses that have prepared now will obviously fare a lot better in the long run. So that was a very brief canter through the lessons that we'd learned from COVID. And obviously we can pick up strands of those themes when we break out into our breakout sessions. So I'm going to hand back to Robert now.
That brings us to the conclusion of the webinar this morning. Thank you to our speakers, and thank you also to our breakout room chairs, and thank you to you too as our guests for joining us this morning and listening to our latest thoughts on Brexit. With that, thank you very much for your time, and thank you again to our speakers and chairs. We will call it a day. Thank you very much.